Good evening and welcome to the 166th Landon Lecture on Public Affairs. The Landon Lectures began in 1966 by the late Governor Alf Landon and the late K-State President James McCain. The goal of the Landon Lectures is to bring the most prominent thought leaders to Kansas State University to discuss the pressing issues of the day. We are very pleased today to welcome Mr. Steve Forbes to the Landon podium to join 165 predecessors in bringing their thoughts and opinions on important public issues. First, though, I'd like to introduce some of our distinguished guests in the audience. Tonight we have Regent Ann Murguia. Ann, if you're here, will you please stand and be recognized? Okay, thank you. We're also joined by several members of the Kansas Legislature. Would you all please stand and be recognized? There we go. Thank you. While I get to stand up and do the introduction, there are actually a lot of other people that make this evening possible, and I'd like to introduce some of our campus leadership at this time. And I'd ask that you hold your applause, and we ask those folks to stand. Dr. Jackie Hartman, Chairperson of the Landon Lecture Series and Chief of Staff in the Office of the President. Dr. Barry Flinchbaugh, Chair of the Landon Patrons and Professor in Agricultural Economics. Dr. Dave Rental, President of the Faculty Senate, Associate Director of the Division of Biology. Carrie Jennings, President of the University Support Staff Senate. And Reagan Kays, K-State Student Body President and Senior in Agribusiness. Let's give them a big round of applause. Thank them for being here tonight. Thank you. Mr. Steve Forbes is the Chairman and Editor-in-Chief of Forbes Media, the nation's leading business magazine with a circulation of more than 900,000. Under Steve Forbes' leadership, the company has launched a variety of new publications and businesses, including Forbes Life, the dedicated luxury lifestyle and culture magazine, Forbes Europe, Forbes Asia, and Forbes licensees editions in more than 30 countries. In addition, Forbes Media is active in the new media arena. Forbes.com is a leading business website that reaches well over 30 million visitors a month. Mr. Forbes is a four-time winner of the Crystal Owl Award, a prize formerly given by the U.S. Steel Corporation to the financial journalist whose economic forecast for the coming year proved most accurate. He is also author of several books, including his latest, Money, How the Destruction of the Dollar Threatens the Global Economy and What We Can Do About It, which won the coveted Leonard E. Read Book Award. In both 1996 and 2000, Forbes campaigned for the Republican nomination for president with a platform that included a flat tax, medical savings accounts, a new Social Security system, school choice, term limits, and a strong national defense. Steve Forbes also has served two presidents, Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, as chairman of the Bipartisan Board for International Broadcasting, where he oversaw the operations of Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty. Mr. Forbes earned his Bachelor of Arts in History from Princeton in 1970 and serves on the boards of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation, the Heritage Foundation, and the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. He is on the board of overseers of the Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, on the board of visitors for the School of Public Policy of Pepperdine University. He previously served on the board of trustees at Princeton University for 10 years. I'd also like to share that Steve's father, Malcolm Forbes, gave a Landon lecture in 1978. Please give a warm Wildcat welcome to Mr. Steve Forbes.
Well, thank you very, very much, Kirk, for those very, very kind words. Thank all of you for the warm welcome. Thank you for the great weather. More than one person with a straight face has told me this is year-round. But as Kirk indicated, I did come here in 1978 with my father when he gave a Landon lecture. It was in January. It was cold, and there was a lot of snow, and it was coming down. So maybe we've had global warming since then, so you don't have snow anymore, but I kind of doubt that. It is an honor to be here, in no small part with a lecture named after Governor Landon. He was an extraordinary entrepreneur, very, very successful, established a successful business, but he was also a humane public servant. As governor, he cut taxes in the Depression, kept expenditures in line, but did a lot of things to relieve the great distress of that terrible era, that economic catastrophe. Among other things, he put a moratorium on foreclosures of mortgages, realizing that for a period of time these things were beyond people's control. So he knew how to do the right thing, both in making sure that taxpayers' money was not wasted, but also in making sure that during a time of real economic contraction, people were not left on their own, helping people who couldn't help themselves because of adverse circumstances. He also recognized the U.S.'s role in the world. Back in the 1930s, if you read your history, it was a great isolationist decade. America did not want to have anything to do with the world. He went against the grain even before the U.S. was brought into the Second World War in December of 1941. Governor Landon was an advocate of aiding Britain, which was for a period of time fighting Nazi Germany alone, willing to have urge the U.S. government to give billions of dollars to Britain to help fight that war before we came in. He also opposed in that decade the so-called Neutrality Acts, which put severe restrictions on the U.S.'s ability to help countries which were under attack. He thought that if the evil was running amok in the world, you had to do something about it. So this evening, what I'd like to do, in the spirit of Governor Landon, is to make some remarks about the economy, both our economy and the global economy. And the reason is very simple. We live in one of these periods of time where America is unsure of its role, and it's critical because the economy not only involves our well-being and the world's well-being, but also involves the safety of the world, the security of the world. If democracy and free enterprise are not seen to be working, if the U.S. is seen as weak and unengaged, then political extremists around the world arise and get strength. Fanatics around the world arise and get strength. And people who figure they can grab things that are not theirs gain strength. We see it with ISIS in the Middle East, not to mention what's happening in Nigeria. You see it with Iran's push to get nuclear weapons to cow part of the world and develop ballistic missiles that can eventually deliver those nuclear weapons to our shores. We see it with Putin's seizing of Crimea and now trying to conquer Ukraine, and before this is over, he'll probably try to make moves against other neighboring countries. We see it with occasional aggressive probes of the Chinese government into disputed territories in the Pacific. We saw in a deadly way, and Governor Landon recognized this in the 1930s, where we almost lost civilization. In the 1970s was another terrible decade when America was seemingly in malaise and decline, not doing its part that it should in the world. Amazingly, given what happened subsequently, the Soviet Union was seen as ascendant. Central America and Africa seemed to be falling more and more under communist influence. Parts of Europe wanted to appease the Soviet Union instead of standing up to it. And we're still living with the consequences today of the mullahs taking over Iran in the late 1970s and the then Russian Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. We're still living with the consequences of that act today. So today, the U.S. seems to be in malaise. Things seem to be out of control. And this then leads to, why is this happening? Is this something inevitable? We hear these words today, the new normal. Actually, what we're going through is the new abnormal, and it's not going to last. Just as we shook out of the 1930s, came back from the 1970s, we're going to come out of this terrible period in the next few years. And this gets then to the basics of how do you get an economy to move? How do you make progress? And this comes to asking a very simple question. How do you achieve progress? And that's answered with another question. What is the difference, and George Gilder, the technologist, and others have asked this, what is the difference between us today, human beings today, and people in the Stone Age? Same appetites, same bodies, same planet. What's the difference between us and them? It always boils down to this. We have more knowledge. We know more. Simple as that. Even if you have physical destruction, if knowledge is not destroyed, you can quickly recover from physical devastation. We saw that after World War II. Western Europe was devastated. Japan was physically devastated. 2 nuclear bombs dropped on it to end the war. Millions of people died. And yet, because of the U.S. security umbrella, Western Europe and Japan quickly came back from that huge devastation in a matter of a few years, which experts thought was absolutely impossible. But the key thing was knowledge was not destroyed. And you see it today, numerous examples of knowledge at work. Take, for example, a country much in the news these days, the State of Israel. The modern State of Israel was founded in 1948. Since the founding in 1948, Israel's population has grown more than tenfold. Its arable land has grown threefold. Its agricultural output 16-fold. Its industrial output more than 50-fold. Yet, the net use of water today in Israel, thanks to knowledge, technology, the net use of water in Israel today is 10% less than it was in 1948. That's the power. That's the real source of wealth in the world. It's not physical things. They're the manifestation of the true source of capital, which is indeed the human mind. Now, earlier today, I spoke to some business students and made the observation about economics that economists don't do their profession any good when they talk about heart-throbbing things like the allocation of scarce resources, not like 50 Shades of Gray, allocation of scarce resources. Pretty dull stuff. But the key thing about economics is not allocating resources, that's a part of it, but it's secondary to what true economics is about, and that is the creation of resources. As we discussed with the kids, there are very few natural resources in the world. Take, for example, oil. Oil is always referred to as a natural resource. It is anything but. In and of itself, it is simply gooey stuff, glop. You can't eat it, you can't drink it, you can't feed it to camels, it's just goo. What turns this glop into something we can't live without was human ingenuity, turning it into energy more and more efficiently. We see it too in terms of free markets. Free markets, if allowed to operate, will always, without exception, turn scarcity into abundance, figuring out how to make things cheaper, make things better. One example, of course, is the automobile. 110 years ago, a car cost the equivalent today of over $120,000. Toy for the rich. Then along comes Henry Ford and his engineers, develop the moving assembly line, and turn a toy for the rich into something every working person could afford. More modern example, what we used to call cell phones, now handhelds or mobile devices. You saw the first cell phone 30 years ago? Big as a shoebox, weighed as much as a brick, 40-minute battery life. The first one, which was made by Motorola, $3,995. Today, billions around the world, most of them given away as part of a plan with a provider. And now we're going to soon have handhelds, smart handhelds, $25, $30, $35 a pop. Amazing technology. And for those of you who love sports and movies, flat screen TVs. I'm old enough to remember when those things fetched $15,000 to $20,000. Now you can get them for a few $100s. And this has implications which I'll discuss in a moment in the field of health care. We're told that there's a lot of scarcity. We have to make hard choices in the future. No, we don't have to make hard choices. We have to make the right choices and turn scarcity into abundance and more affordability. But you look around the world, it's a troubled world. The U.S. economy, doing better, but still we're like a car that had been going 30 miles an hour. Now we're getting up to maybe 40. We should be going 65 or 70 miles an hour. If nobody's looking, maybe 80 miles an hour. So, better not say that to kids, but anyway. So we only look good. We only look fast because the rest of the world is doing worse. Europe is in trouble. Much of Europe is in a recession or semi-recession. Latin America is in trouble. They're stagnating, Brazil and others. Japan, still mired in semi-recession. You look at China, they're having difficult problems making reforms. So what in the world is going on? Why aren't we moving ahead? So let me touch on a few big things. One is, and I hesitate to do this because you're such nice people, but it has to be done, and that is start with a subject that is critically important, but is not the kind of thing that excites you like a good Super Bowl or watching certain movies. And that is the subject of monetary policy, money. Now, when you say monetary policy, Federal Reserve, Ben Bernanke, Janet Yellen, Greenspan, exchange rates, blah, 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 the eyes get heavy. And so let me, as a reward, give you a little reward for what I'm about to do to you, discussing this subject. That is a travel tip. If you ever find yourself in an airplane, in coach, middle seat, on the runway, watching your life pass away, you want a little bit of elbow room with your seatmates, start talking to them about monetary policy. They'll cut you a wide berth. In a similar vein, got a lot of young people here. Any of you are single, on a bad date and want out? Start talking about monetary policy and you'll never see that person again, guaranteed. But the subject is critically important, money. And the reason is very, very simple. Even if we get it right on taxation, on spending, on regulation, if you don't get monetary policy right, if you don't get the money right, you're going to have a troubled economy. And this gets to that question, how do we achieve progress? Well, the mechanism through achieving progress is we seek knowledge, which comes from constant experimentation. We think of experimentation in the lab, but it happens in the markets every day, people coming up with new things, see what works, what doesn't work, things that fail. Failure you learn from as well. Some of you may be old enough to remember in the days of Apple before Steve Jobs came back, a product called the Newton. Failure, but came up with technology that enabled things like the iPod. So you learn from failure, getting that knowledge. But the way we achieve progress in that seeking is we trade with each other. We exchange with each other. Say, you want to bake a cake. You got to get the ingredients. You got to get the eggs. You got to get the milk, the flour, and the like. You got to get the electricity. You got to get the stove, the oven. Got to get the refrigerator. Got to get the measuring spoons and the like. All of these things. So you do it through buying and selling, through exchange. We do it billions of times a day. Don't think anything of it anymore. But all this is done through trading with one another. As individuals, we can't do much of anything. Imagine we have to do everything ourselves. We'd still be living in caves. But this interacting with one another, exchanging with one another, is how we moved ahead. And so what makes this exchange possible? Money. Now, in the old days, we had barter. So if I sold an ad in Forbes 3,000 years ago, how would I get paid? Perhaps with a herd of goats. Let's say I wanted to buy iPads for our writers, being a little facetious here, but I go to the Apple store with a herd of goats. The store owner says, no, he doesn't want goats, he wants sheep. So I have to then figure out how to swap the goats for sheep, perhaps hire a sheep herder to make sure the wolves don't eat the sheep. Sheep herder wants to be paid with wine. I've got red wine, he wants white wine. Becomes very, very cumbersome. So money was invented in the marketplace by people, markets are people, trying to figure out how to make it easy to exchange with one another, trade with one another. So the first coins, historians tell us, was invented by a state called Lydia, near the Greek states, 2,600 years ago. Athens soon came up with their own coin, what was called the Athenian owl, a silver coin. Became a great commercial and cultural center. But whether it's coins, pieces of paper, or ellipses or blips on a computer, money is a means of doing transactions. And this gets to something very, very important. Money facilitates buying and selling. But money in and of itself, unless you have one of these ancient rare coins, money in and of itself has no intrinsic value. None. It simply measures value, the way scales measure weight, or rulers measure length, or clocks measure time. So money in and of itself is not wealth. It measures wealth. It's a claim. Think of it as a claim on products and services, like a coat check at a restaurant. You use it to claim your coat. But it's a claim. But in and of itself, it's nothing. And it only works based on trust. If you don't trust it, it doesn't work. If you trust it, total strangers can trade with one another because they trust that that piece of paper or that notation on a computer is worth something, be a claim on other products and services. So money works best when it has a fixed value, just as you have fixed weights and measures in the marketplace. You buy a gallon of gasoline, you assume it's a certain size. It doesn't fluctuate each day. You buy a pound of potato chips. Maybe I should say what's something pure, but anyway, potato chips, hamburger, cheese, whatever it is you want to buy, you assume it's 16 ounces. It doesn't fluctuate each day. So just a moment, play one little mind game. Imagine for a moment our central bank, the Federal Reserve, did to clocks what it does to the dollar. Imagine floating the clock. 60 minutes an hour one day, 48 minutes the day after, 93 minutes the day after that. Life would be chaotic if the clock changed in terms of time each day. Imagine trying to bake that cake we talked about. It says bake the batter for 40 minutes. You have to figure out, is that nominal minutes? Inflation-adjusted minutes? Is it a Kansas minute? A Mexican minute? Japanese minute? It'd be chaotic. So when you have a stable money, it makes life easier. So you don't even have to think about it. And prices. When we go out and buy things, prices give us information about what something is worth. Prices give us information. Something is hot, not hot. Prices give us that essential information. And so what happens if you have unstable money? It's like a virus in a computer. It corrupts the information. For example, oil in the 1970s. None of you are old enough to remember the 70s. Yeah, it's called pandering. Tried it in politics, didn't work, which is why I'm here today. But in the 1970s, when we shoved the dollar off the rails, kept devaluing it, oil went from $3 to $40 a barrel. It was going up and up in price, and people figured, gosh, it's going up in price, therefore we must be running out of it. And so a lot of investment was made. Gee, it keeps going up, must mean there's not enough out there. Then in the early 80s, we saw the same thing in agriculture. This state lived through it. Seemed the commodities were only going up and up. Then in the early 80s, when the terrible inflation of the 70s was killed by Ronald Reagan and Paul Volcker at the Federal Reserve, oil crashed from almost $40 a barrel down to $10, finally stabilized at $20 to $25. Agriculture, especially farmers who had levered up, went through a wrenching period. Prices weren't giving the right information. We saw it in the early part of the last decade when we started to play these games again with the dollar. Housing prices started to move up. People thought, well, gee, it must mean we need more houses. The price keeps going up. They even invented a new mortgage. The new mortgage was, why have an income? Who needs it? You know, collateral is going up and up. Well, prices were lying to us because the dollar is unstable in value. So what happens is, when you have an unstable currency, you get less investment in the future. Because investing that leads to a higher standard of living means investing in the things that today are unseen. You want a new product. It's not here today. You invest to create it, like Steve Jobs did with the iPad or the iPhone or the iPod. Building a new factory, same thing. New equipment, the same thing. Things that are today that are unseen. But if you have an unstable currency, what happens is you get less investment in those things. Less investment in the things unseen, and more in things like hard assets. And so that's the reason why we're not doing so well. That's the reason why businesses are going bust at a faster rate than new businesses are being created. Very rarely that happens in American history. It's happening now. It's the reason why median incomes are not going up. We're not getting enough of that investment. So you got to have stable money. How do you do it? Not to totally bore you, but the way we did it for the first 180 years of our existence. We tied it to gold. Now you say that to an economist and they absolutely retch, because they've been taught the superstitions out of the Depression. How do you get that stable value of money? You fix it. Why to gold? Because more than anything else on this earth, it keeps its intrinsic value. When you see the price fluctuate, that's not so much the value of gold as it is people's perceptions about the value of the dollar today and what it might be tomorrow. But when you have we don't fix it, the dollar goes all over the place. The dollar now is strong today. That's like that clock. When you have a watch, you don't want it to be too fast, you don't want it to be too slow, you want it to be the right time. So gold, not perfect, but it's the best thing we have. It doesn't mean we go around with gold coins. That would be pretty inefficient. So talking about with the kids today, imagine going to McDonald's, buying a $1.89 hamburger and giving a gold coin and trying to get $1,150 in change. No, not very efficient. But all it means is like a ruler, just as a ruler measures length. Gold keeps that value fixed. So it doesn't restrict the economy. If you have a booming economy, you create more money. So let's say we fixed the dollar to gold, let's say $1,200 an ounce, pick a number. All it means if it goes above $1,200, you create fewer dollars, goes below $1,200, you create more dollars. Very simple. We did it for 180 years, and it worked. Even though we had Civil War, 2 world wars, Great Depression, the growth rate in that 180 years from the time of George Washington to the 1970s, the growth rate in the U.S. was the greatest long-term run of growth in human history. If we'd maintained that level of growth that we did for 180 years in the last 40 years, our economy today would be 50% larger, $8 trillion bigger. Now imagine if you had an economy 50% bigger, incomes 50% higher. Life would be a lot better. Now, it may not do miracles this year in basketball, but there's some things that money can't do alone, but it certainly would be a much better life. And so that's what happens. And let me just close on this subject of money before I quickly hit on taxes and health care. Is a quote from John Maynard Keynes. We're talking about economics, which we think is number, GDP, and all that stuff. But when you have an unstable money, since it's based on trust, if you can't trust it anymore, as we discuss in a book that I wrote called Money, when people cease to trust money, they cease to trust each other. So here's what John Maynard Keynes, who got some things right, here's what he said 90 years ago. He said, Lenin was certainly right. Lenin was the one who created communism in the Soviet Union. He said, Lenin was certainly right. There's no subtler, no surer means of overturning the existing basis of society than to debauch the currency. The process engages all the hidden forces of economic law on the side of destruction, and does it in a manner which not one man in a million is able to diagnose. Now, he was talking about a hyperinflation, but if you have this volatility over time, even if it isn't rapid, it still erodes what you might call social trust. And we see it playing out today. Research has shown, by the way, around the world, that countries that routinely debase the money have higher rates of crime than countries that don't. Social trust, you see it today. More social divisions, the 1% versus the 99, the 40% versus everybody else, the young versus old, public sector versus private sector. It mocks values. You try to save money today, you kind of look like a fool given the rates of interest. It seems to have a disconnect between honest effort and reward speculation. So this is critical, boring but absolutely critical. I think we're starting to move in the right direction. Former head of the Federal Reserve, Paul Volcker, said since we went off gold, we've had more crises. Now, he didn't endorse a gold standard, but he started the process. The first thing you have to do is recognize you have a problem. What we're doing is not working. It's not working here, it's not working around the world. That's the first step. Then we can start asking the question, what do we do now? Now, another area where I think we're going to see much more rapid progress is taxes. I know this may be a sensitive subject in this state, but I'm not running for anything, so I'll let it out. America is overtaxed. And the thing to recognize about taxation, it's not just a way of raising revenue, it's also a price and a burden. The tax you pay on income is the price you pay for working. The tax on profits, the price you pay for being successful, and the tax on capital gains, the price you pay for taking risks that work out. The idea is a very simple one. When you lower the price of good things like productive work, risk-taking, success, you get more of them. Raise the price, you get less of them. Now, you look at our tax code today, the federal income tax code, it is a total deadweight on the U.S. economy. Put it in perspective, Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address defined the character of the American nation, all of 272 words. Declaration of Independence, a little over 1,300 words. The Constitution, all the amendments, a little over 7,200 words. The Bible, which took centuries to put together, 773,000 words. Now, the federal income tax code, not just the code itself, which is 4 million words, but all the attendant rules and regulations, about another 5 million, about 8 to 9 million words. Nobody knows what's in it. The IRS doesn't know. Half the time, a third of the time you call their hotline, they used to answer them, and they give you the wrong answer and hold you responsible for it. Several years ago, Money Magazine did a survey. They took a hypothetical family's finances, gave the numbers to 46 different tax preparers people considered top in the field. You know what they got back? 46 different returns, 46 different estimates of what the family owed, thousands of dollars of difference, this from people who make their living at the thing. There's only one thing to do, and I think we're going to have it happen in 2 years, because several candidates are going to advocate it next year, is to take this beast, kill it, drive a stake through its heart, bury it, and hope it never rises again. Just start all over again with the federal income tax code. I'd replace it with a simple flat tax. About to unveil in a few days a new version of it. Generous exemptions for adults and for kids, single rate. Family of 4 would pay no federal income tax on their first $52,000 of wages. No tax on savings, no death taxes. You should be allowed to leave the world unmolested by the IRS. Or, as our founders would say, no taxation without respiration. And do the same thing on the business side. Cut the rate from 35 to 17%. No more, if you make a capital expenditure, write it off in the year in which you lay out the cash. You have a loss carried forward against future profits. You do that, stable dollar, and a tax code where we're no longer spending 6 billion hours a year filling out tax forms. You could literally do it on a sheet of paper. 30 countries have done a variation of it. This is not a theory. Imagine doing a sheet of paper, a few keystrokes, and it's done. Imagine the brain power released to do productive things. You know, I'm getting older. We all are. I like the idea of more medical research, conquering diseases. That's a good thing, better than filling out tax forms or trying to interpret an indecipherable tax code. So that's going to come, I think. Then another thing that looks like a crisis today, but I think is setting the stage for something profoundly positive, is this area of health care. Ask yourselves, why do we have a health care crisis? The usual answer is, well, people like me are getting older, we want more health care services, more medicines, and so the thing becomes more expensive, it spins out of control, people can't get it, and we've got a problem. But ask yourselves, step back for a moment, ask yourselves, why is it that demand for medical care, health care, is considered a disaster, whereas demand for everything else is considered a positive? Great opportunity for entrepreneurs. You want more apps, writers glad to help you out. You want more food, people in this state glad to help you out. You want more aircraft, some manufacturers glad to help you out. So what's with health care? Why is demand seen as disaster everywhere else in the economy seen as a great opportunity? It's because we don't have real free markets in health care. This grew up over the past 70 years. Nobody designed it, it just evolved. Crazy, like a monster movie. We have pieces of it, which is why we still have the best health care in the world, still turning out more new devices and new drugs than the rest of the world. But it's a crazy system. You know, you go to a clinic or hospital and you ask in advance what it costs, you get a very strange look. It means one of two things. Either you're uninsured or you're a lunatic. Why would you want to know the price? What's it to you? It's all third party. There's a disconnect between provider and consumer. Now, can you imagine going out to dinner tonight, ordering a fine meal and saying, I don't care what it costs, let Aetna or Blue Shield or Medicare worry about it. Let Medicaid sort the thing out. It becomes chaotic. But you know, a new system is beginning to rise. Not what we had before, not the Affordable Care Act, but a whole new system where for the first time in our lifetimes, patients will truly be in charge. Now, it's messy. It's going to be convoluted. So my advice is don't get sick for the next 3 years until this thing sorts itself out. But you can see little signs of it. For example, flu shots in terms of healthcare delivery. Once upon a time you wanted a flu shot, made an appointment at that clinic or hospital or the doctor, went there, got the shot. Today you go anywhere. You go to the drugstore, go to the airport, go to the gas station, say, fill her up, give me a flu shot, do the windshield while you're at her. It's available everywhere. Available everywhere. You see it in walk-in clinics more and more. CVS, Walgreens, and others, nurse practitioner, research shows that 80% of our maladies can be treated by nurses and technicians. Others, we need the full-fledged physician. But you go in there, if you have a serious problem, then they send you to the hospital. You see it in other areas. For example, LASIK surgery for the eyes. So you might not have to wear these things. Costs less today than it did 10 years ago. Why? Because there's not the disconnect between providers and consumers. Our publisher, Rich Karlgaard, got the thing done 11 years ago, cost him $5,000. He told me a few months ago that he could get it done today at half the price and probably a better result. Why? Not because there's not that disconnect, so providers have every incentive to make it more affordable and better for you. And so in terms of health care, we're going into a system, the new system evolving, where finally we're going to get that miracle of turning scarcity into abundance. Now again, human nature being what it is, we'll soon just take it for granted. I mean, look at these handhelds today. I'm old enough to remember when you placed a call overseas, this back in the 50s, it was a big deal. It took minutes to do it. Today, you place a call to Outer Mongolia. If it takes more than 5 seconds, you say, this device is a piece of crap. It's taking 6 seconds to reach Outer Mongolia. What is this? So we'll take it for granted. But the bottom line is, if we just don't lose it in the rest of the world, and we will find ways around it, we've been through rougher periods before, we're setting the stage in a very messy way for an extraordinary new era ahead. Thank you very much.
We do have time for some questions, so we'd ask that people, if you have a question, just go to one of the microphones on each side. You can see where somebody's holding their hands up. I'll alternate from one side to the other. We'd also ask your question and just go ahead and sit down so the next person behind you can answer that. So have that opportunity to ask a question as well. So we'll start over here, and please ask your question.
Just wanted to say, loved you on Saturday Night Live.
Thank you.
And wondered, who has a better sense of humor, conservatives or liberals?
But it depends on whether it's real humor or unintended humor. And that depends on what side of the aisle you're sitting on. One of the things, especially if you're a candidate, sometimes people say, why isn't there more humor out in the public square? And the answer is, humor is a very tough thing. If any of you try to do stand-up comedy, it depends on the audience. And what works with one group of people may just fall flat or offend another group. So you're always stepping on a minefield when you go out and try some humor. Now, if you get elected, then you can let it more out. People say, oh, what a great wit you have. But by golly, before getting in there, you got to be very careful very careful on how you employ that. And I've got some of the scars to show for it. So,
Sir.
Yes, Mr. Forbes, thank you very much for coming to Kansas State University, first of all. My question is fairly simple. How far farther in debt do you think the U.S. can go before bankruptcy is declared?
the U.S. debt is growing, and what makes it of real concern is it's not the result of fighting a world war. In World War II, we amassed very quickly, proportionally more debt, far more debt than we have today, but we're literally fighting around the world for civilization. All the economy, you couldn't buy shoes during the war very rarely, you couldn't buy cars, rationing was all dedicated to winning the conflict. So you ran up a huge debt. But we're now doing it without a major world war. And that's not a good thing. And so the answer to it is, first you get the economy growing. When you have the asset side growing, it makes the liability side a lot more easier to live with. And the other key thing is, though, is starting to recognize a very basic principle, and that is there are certain things government does out of necessity, does well, and certain things where it just lacks competence. And there's a lot of things that government is wasteful on. You don't have to just cut that back a little bit or just stop the increase, and the growing economy will rescue you. So spending as a portion of GDP does not go up. On things like Social Security, you don't have to touch benefits for those who are on the system or about to go on the system. Where it's really going to get bad, we have enough wealth in the nation to meet those obligations, but where it really gets bad is with younger people. A lot of you here, the system is going to go kablooey. That's a polite word. I'm not going to use the S word here. But so that's why we should be bringing in, for younger people, a new system where you turn a liability to an asset by having those monies you pay in your payroll taxes, instead of going to Washington where it's spent right away. They pretend it goes in a trust fund, but it doesn't. It goes in your own personal account with proper rules on diversification, proper rules on safety, so you can't go blow it on a horse race or online gambling or anything like that. And over time, for younger people, the amazing thing is, even if you don't invest a dime in stocks, over time, you'll have, when you decide to retire and you pick your own retirement age, 65, 70, 75, whatever you want, you'll have more benefits than the current system is delivering to people of my generation. So that's the way you do it. You know, there are two ways to deal with these problems. One is what you might call root canal without anesthesia, and the other is a little bit of restraint and growth. Growth will solve a lot of problems. And the thing to keep in mind about government is it does not create resources. You create resources in the marketplace. Government can take resources, it can't create them. So when they talk about stimulus, just think of barter. Where do those resources come from? They come from you. So again, we're not talking about anarchy. We're just talking about what does this thing called government do well, and what does it not do so well? And you do that, and then I think a little bit of restraint goes a long way. So you don't have to do drastic things. You don't have to have a hyperinflation. You don't have to have wearing barrels for 30 years or all that kind of stuff. We can move our way out of it. And just one little thing on that, little factoid to leave with you. In the 1980s, the national debt under Reagan more than doubled because he increased, primarily was a lot of things, but the big thing was defense spending. Big increase in defense spending. It worked. We won the Cold War against the Soviet Union, which nobody at the time thought possible, except for Reagan and a few others. So that expenditure worked, but it more than doubled the national debt. Went up over $1.5 trillion, $1.7 trillion in the 1980s. Yet, because of his reforms, slashing taxes, deregulation, a little bit of restraint on the rest of the budget, and other positive things, the net wealth of the nation went went up $17 trillion. So the key is growth, restraint, and we can pull ourselves out of it. And in many ways, just one parenthetical, the banking system in the 80s and early 90s was in far more bad shape than it was in 2008. But back then we made some right decisions. We didn't make so many in that crisis, and we're still paying the price for it today.
Mr. Forbes, thank you very much for coming. And was it about how far should I need coaching on this. So you said the free market, when allowed to operate uninhibited, will always create abundance out of scarcity. And you referenced also in your talk the crisis that we went through in 2008. And the narrative we got from the current administration was that the free market had its chance and it failed. I'm imagining that your take is one a bit different than that. Could you talk about your perspective of what happened?
Well, what happened in 2008 was what happens when you undermine your currency. We saw the same thing in the 70s when the private sector was blamed for the Federal Reserve undermining the dollar when we went off the gold standard. And so it started really, it's not a partisan thing. This started under a Republican administration, continued under a Democrat administration today. So this is not a party thing. By the way, John Kennedy, Democrat, said the dollar should be as good as gold. Ronald Reagan, Republican, as I mentioned, killed that terrible inflation of the 1970s. Bill Clinton, the dollar did well under Bill Clinton. We had the booming 90s. So again, this is not a partisan thing. But the reason, so when we started to go off the rails in the early part of the last decade, they thought cheapening the dollar would help our exports and didn't realize the damage it was going to do to the rest of the economy. That's when, again, when you start to undermine a currency, people go to hard assets. Oil, from the mid-1980s to the early part of the last decade, averaged a little over $21 a barrel. Went up to as high as 147 in 2008. Now it's crashing again. And I think it's over-crashed. I think it's going to have a comeback. But you get this kind of nasty volatility. So all this capital went into housing. And we're still living with the consequences today. And yet the Fed, instead of being punished for its transgressions, instead of the Treasury Department being punished for their transgressions, the Fed is rewarded with massive new powers, saying, it's their fault. Now, this is not to excuse those who did misdeeds in the marketplace, but again, you never could have had what happened on mortgages if you hadn't had a weak dollar. Would not have happened. And again, in the 70s, we saw variations of this movie. So you get your money right, and it solves a lot of problems. Now, we're human, so we're always going to make errors. And when you're trying new things, there's always going to be waste in the marketplace. Remember, we had over 2,000 people try to create auto manufacturing companies in this country, starting from the 1890s onward. And you look at PC makers in the early 80s, a lot of them went by the board. So when people try new things, a lot of them aren't going to work, but that's proper experimentation. But what we saw since in the last decade was purely policy made. And now, yes, Fannie Mae was guilty, Freddie Mac was guilty, but I'm not going to defend their egregious bad behavior. But they were misbehaving in the 1990s when we had a strong dollar and we didn't get the crisis that we had in the last decade. The big difference between the last decade and the 90s, stable dollar, or strong dollar, I should say. Last decade, weak and volatile dollar. We're still seeing that play out today. So, private sector perfect? No, because humans are not perfect. I was discussing earlier about James Madison, father of the U.S. Constitution, said if we were angels, we'd not need government and we'd not need laws. You know, we're not angels, as I said earlier, except for maybe grandkids, but they only to a certain age. And so we do need laws, but the key thing is to have sensible, common sense rules, not the thousands and thousands of pages of regulation today that are smashing the banking sector. One reason why we haven't had more loans to small and new businesses, regulators eat banks alive when they do that. Now they're getting a little easier, not much, but a little easier, which is why we're showing signs of life. They're allowing more, perhaps, sensible pricing of credit. But if they hadn't been so heavy-handed, we'd have been a lot further along today. So again, nothing's perfect, but there are things to be done better than what we did in the last decade.
Good evening, Mr. Forbes. I am Abdurrahman Khiyari from Saudi Arabia, dual majoring in political science and economics. Thanks to you and Forbes Middle East, my family has been featured twice in the best businessmen in the Middle East. On the other hand, when it comes to oil, I love talking about oil. Saudi. In the 70s, King Faisal has caused a major rise in the oil prices, and you've touched on that. Therefore, the United States has responded very heavily in the way they treat oil domestically. Therefore, they put a ban on selling oil to other countries under the name of Homeland Security. Now, that's not the case. And you've talked about having so much knowledge and using that knowledge to change our domestic lives and our economy. Why aren't we seeing such laws changing? Because once countries, now everyone is holding back selling their oil. You're talking about Saudi Arabia, you're talking about Europe, you're talking about internationally, everyone is holding their oil. And they're reaching their capacity. And once that happens, oil is going to drop again. And the United States is going to get hurt. Why aren't we seeing opening trade for the United States and having the United States being able to export oil? And that would be a very great help for the United States. I think that would be a great help for the United States.
Yeah, even though we gain new knowledge, sometimes the powers that be are slow to digest that knowledge. And the embargo on exporting oil is totally counterproductive. One reason why oil production may now go down in the United States, one reason why the natural gas boom may be damaged even more than it's being damaged now, is that there's no place to store the oil. We're literally running out of storage capacity in many parts of the country. And the natural thing would be, if we have a ready market, is to sell it. We should be becoming a major energy producer, but that crazy law stands in the way. And it's like saying Kansas can't sell to Oklahoma. We have the Interstate Commerce Clause, which makes this a big free trade area. But this barrier on oil is absolutely counterproductive. And it's harming an industry that, thanks to technology, fracking, horizontal drilling with oil, and other breakthroughs, especially in finding out what's actually down there, huge breakthroughs in a very, very tough industry. When the dollar is not weak, oil and energy is often a low-margin, tough business. But our government's gone in and made it infinitely more tougher, just as they are for a lot of other businesses. So that's a self-inflicted wound. Take it off, and let's get the production to meet the natural demand of the marketplace. If people know that there's a steady supply, there's no reason why it shouldn't be in this country. We'll get more and more companies moving their facilities here because we can provide energy very cheaply. Germany, which went whole hog for alternative energies, their electricity prices are 2 to 3 times what they are here in the United States. And their chemical producers, Germany has always been very big in chemicals, are putting their new investment here in the U.S. because we have that supply of energy. Manufacturers, the same thing. So this is where, if the government gets out of the way There's a lot of harvesting that can be done in this country in an area where we thought a few years ago, energy washed up. No, it's really just beginning if we let it.
We have time for one last question.
You mentioned the Fed earlier and Chairman Yellen, and the big question now in the Fed is these post-QE rate hikes. The equities markets are going bananas speculating on when these rate hikes are going to be. Do you think the economy is strong enough to see these rate hikes late summer, early fall?
Well, the question is, one of the reasons why we've had such a punk recovery to 2.5% growth for 6 years, why the labor force participation rate, that people actually who could work, seeking work in the marketplace, is now lower than it's been in 35 years, is because we haven't had that investment. One reason we haven't had that investment is we don't know what the real price of money is. You know, price controls, go back to the Romans, Diocletian and others, try to put in price controls, end up mucking up the market. You know, rent controls, great. If you get an apartment in New York for $20 a month, boy, that's great. But no one's going to build an apartment if they only can get $20 a month. So what the Fed has done with the suppression of interest rates, not just short-term rates, but across the board, in the name of helping us, it's hurt us. It's hurt us. And that's why you had this but this huge appetite for corporate bonds, junk bonds, because the Fed had gobbled up so much of the long-term treasuries. They totally distorted the market. Once upon a time, there used to be, those of you in the banking business know, a thing called the interbank market. If you had excess reserves, you'd lend it to a bank that could put it to work. Thriving market. Today, it's dead. Dead as the proverbial doornail. And so the quicker they get out of trying to price everything, the better things will be. Now, the key thing, too, if you could couple it, we'll probably have to wait a couple of years before we get it, with major tax reform, you would see this economy start to recover very, very quickly. And instead of regulators now, as I said today, regulators make it very difficult for banks to lend. People say, rightly, well, loan demand may not be what it should be, but I'll just give you one anecdote. I was in Philadelphia the other day, talked with a recent graduate of the Wharton Business School. She and a partner had started a unique restaurant, some kind of sandwiches, doing very well, positive cash flow from day one, so they want to open another restaurant in Philadelphia. Go to the bank, ask for $300,000, the bank says $60,000 with conditions. And she said, look, we've shown that we can run a business cash flow positive, so your risk is not out of the norm. Bank wouldn't do it. So they're going to have to try to scrounge up money from elsewhere. And that's the kind of thing that just, you multiply that, slows the economy down. And I don't blame the bank, because if they lend her the $300,000, a regulator would come in and say, what are you doing? This is risky. Well, guess what, guys? Lending is risky. And good bankers know how to do it. And Dodd-Frank does not. So,
Folks, please join me once again in thanking Steve Forbes for an intriguing lecture.
thank you.
you.
Thank you.